look at these webinars on our YouTube channel, Sustainable Infrastructure, which, by the way, is also live streaming the current video on that same channel. You could follow us on Twitter at susinfra with the hashtag INFRA+. And also you could see the website susinfra.com. My name is Fadi Shaya, and I'm an urban and architectural scholar at the Manchester Architectural Research Group. It is my pleasure to chair today's panel, which engages the topic of violence in infrastructure scholarship from leading academics in the field. Please join me in welcoming our three panelists for today, Professor Chattopadhyay and Dr. Deljana Iossifova and Dr. Yaffa Truelove. Dr. Chattopadhyay is professor at the Department of History of Art and Architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is an architect and historian specializing in modern architecture and urbanism and the cultural landscapes of the British Empire. Professor Chattopadhyay is the recipient of many awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the founding editor of the Digital Venue platform, the editor of the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, and a previous director of the Subaltern Popular Workshop across the UC campuses. In 2018, she was named as a fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians for a lifetime of significant contributions to the field. Our second panelist, Dr. Deljana Iossifova, is senior lecturer, that is associate professor in urban studies at the University of Manchester, where she is director of the Confucius Institute. She is also the chair of the Urban Studies Foundation, and she currently leads a portfolio of research on sustainable infrastructure and transitions. She has worked on complex urban transformations, cities and biodiversity, and the human ecosystem of aging. Her main research focus is on the global East and South, including China, Japan, Bulgaria, India, and Brazil. As an architect, she practiced in Germany, China, Japan, and the USA. Our third panelist is Dr. Yaffa Truelove, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Geography at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research concerns lie at the nexus of urban and feminist political ecology, where she examines the connections between urban waterscapes and socio-political processes in cities of the global South. Particularly, her current research examines water and its infrastructures as a lens for analyzing social and material relations in cities, as well as differing regimes and institutions of everyday urban governance. Our three panelists will present their works. Each has 25 to 30 minutes. They will share their presentations and present their talks. Then we will open the floors for Q&A at the end of all three presentations. So in the meantime, please type your questions in the chat box if you have any direct, any instant idea or question. And again, we will address them at the end of all three talks. I take this opportunity to thank Yahya and Tarquin for their technical support of this session. And I welcome Professor Chattopadhyay to start the panel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Fadi, and thank you, Deljana, for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. And let me share my screen. So let me begin by posing a question. Are there instances of state or corporate infrastructures that are not violent? In different degrees, all physical infrastructures, roads, railways, canals, airports, utility lines, are violent, though useful, because they're often deadly interventions. They're constructed by interfering with the soil, gradient, drainage of an area. They disrupt wildlife and a host of habitats besides human habitations. They affect the quality and experience of airspace. The spatial logic of such physical infrastructure confronts and proliferates a range of social structural inequities on a daily basis. Our collective shock in witnessing the brutal withholding of infrastructure, such as the railways from migrant workers in India during COVID last year, as a strategy of containment, is founded on an assumption, a trust, that state-controlled infrastructures are meant to enable social life. In what follows, I want to bring together three figures: transportation infrastructure, strategies of containment, and infrastructure in a more capacious sense that attends to the infra in infrastructure. That is, the factors that lie underneath the level of visibility. And this am asking us to think through what I call the everyday modalities of the biospatial. I define biospatial as the spatial organization of life and death that characterizes modern states, both colonial states and modern post-colonial nation states. My introduction of this term tries to clear some ground between the debates on biopolitics and necropolitics to think through those infrastructural means that carry over from colonial to post-colonial polities to articulate sovereign claims. The significant and growing volume of work that considers the architectural and urban dimensions of the biopolitical, and this is after Hannah Arendt, Michel Foucault, Giorgio Agamben, Achille Mbembe, Roberto Esposito, Paul Gilroy, and many others, and I'm referring to the group of work that refers to or is trying to rethink what the biopolitical aspects of spaces are, particularly in relation to refugee camps. For the most part, these scholars who worked on this have focused on bounded spaces of detention and control, rather than the open space of the city and country. My inquiry here is less about what happens inside bounded spaces, although that's important, but really about how boundaries are defined as mechanisms of control and how they're negotiated and asserted. Infrastructures are by definition lines of control. Transportation infrastructures in particular are investment opportunities and techniques of expropriation. Take India's railway network, for example. It grew at a pace really fast after 1861, and this is no technological inevitability. The rapid growth of the post-Sepoy rebellion decades of the railways spatially mirrored the growth of military cantonments. If we simply weigh the affordances against the depredations that infrastructures produce, we miss a few important dimensions about how infrastructures operate. Rather, I suggest we need to look at not infrastructure is as an artifact, but its modality, what it does, how it does it. Infrastructures enable and disable differentially. Our blindness to its differential purchase is a result of the way we privilege infrastructure as representational space, its strategic and symbolic use. Infrastructures as representational space relies on relations among infrastructures, ones that are often not evident if we focus on the artifact and its construction. That is, if we focus on its construction rather than how it operates. To disaggregate the idea of infrastructure, we need to attend to the infra in infrastructure, the workings that remain below the threshold of visibility. Only in moments of crises, these workings are revealed. I've been looking at the relation between infrastructure and sovereignty, focusing on some pivotal events in the 19th and 20th century, particularly in colonial India, to see how infrastructure was conceptualized and mobilized, how it was staged as representational space, and how it was normalized. One of the issues that interest me is the relation between infrastructure and martial law that generates a racially grounded biospace. So what I want to do today is share with you some notes from two events: the Santhal Rebellion of 1855 and the quote-unquote disturbances in Western and Northern India between March and May 1919, as discussed in the Disorders Inquiry Committee Report of 1920, commonly known as the Hunter Committee Report. So let's begin with the Santal Rebellion. Between 1780 and 1840, the Santals, a peripatetic people, had been herded into an area called Daminico in eastern India on the borders of present-day West Bengal and Jharkhand. The objective was to use Santal labor for clearing jungles for cultivation. In 1832-33, the Damin, an area of approximately 1,400 square miles, was constructed as a bounded space to control the interaction of the Santals with the surrounding indigenous communities. Initially marked by natural features and pillars, the Damin boundary was strengthened and made absolute by police stations at small intervals. As Prathama Banerjee, in her brilliant work, The Politics of Time, has noted, it was also argued that the boundary must be made precisely mathematical and in straight lines wherever possible. Natural features, the government argued, tended to be tempered by the primitives and by nature itself. The Santals' bounded space meant they could no longer avoid the colonial state. Santal villages, as mobile assemblies, became spatially fixed, thus creating new boundary disputes that required the mediation of the state. The Santals were subjected to ruinous interest rates by moneylenders, and the complaints about how they were treated by moneylenders were not heeded by the colonial court, rather in the colonial court. The British administrator in charge of the Damin made Santals experiment with new cash crops. Forced to extend cultivation beyond the fertile stretch, their crops became vulnerable to natural disasters, and this made them completely dependent on the discretionary rights of the colonial state to forego revenue claims. The Damin was crisscrossed with roads built by the state in an effort to chase after the Santals who wanted to flee from this bondage. Having divorced Santal society from freely exchanging goods with outsiders, the colonial state instituted marketplaces for the sale of goods from the outside world. This included English loincloths, caps, and jackets. Exchanging goods for money, understood to be, and I quote, congealed power over the future, was expected to civilize the Santals, who refused to produce a surplus of everything. All transactions with other groups were mediated in and through the colonial marketplace, other locations of trade being prohibited in the Damin. The Santal rebellion constituted a wholesale challenge to the codes that defined the Damin as representational space, as a containment for exercising spatial and temporal relations of power. On one fine day, the British administrators and the Bengali landlords and moneylenders suddenly recognized that the peace-loving Santals had rebelled against colonial authority. The officiating magistrate of Bhagalpur hastily penned a note to William Gray, the secretary to the Bengal government in Calcutta, in the fading light of 9th July 1855. And I read, "My dear Gray, I write a line in a great hurry to let you know that the Santals of this district have risen to take possession of the country. And as they are in considerable force, the police of these districts will not be able to stop them. And so I write to ask you if you think fit to get order passed for the sending of troops per rail, as far as they can go to the roads by which the Santals will most likely to return home. The natives are in a great state of consternation. The railway people are arming and barricading themselves in various places. The dock, which is the post, is just going, and so I'm in a great hurry." A nominal reading shows Richardson trying to assemble the state infrastructure. In response, Gray wrote to Richardson, produce maps. The administrators worried that the insurrection would spread to the adjacent communities, which it did, and that the army and police had no military advantage when fighting the Santals in the forest, understood to be their quote-unquote native habitat. The Santals, proficient hunters, knew paths and trails that were unrecognizable to colonial authorities. The sites of colonial authority that marked the landscape, the bungalow, court, police station, railways, post office, the residence and office of the landlords, and the marketplace were picked out by Santals as specific targets of insurgency. They disrupted the colonial communication system by destroying the infrastructure that aided the relation between the state, the moneylender, and the landlord. While the Santals took control of the sign systems that marked the colonial landscape, the colonial state appeared hobbled by its own governing practices and modes of envisioning the landscape. The state could only apprehend the rebellion in terms of its own infrastructure and the conception of space and representational practices congruent with such infrastructure. That is congruent with the infrastructural practices that were based on a desire for exactitude, certainty, permanence of objects carrying fixed meaning, and discrete bounded events that could be placed in a narrative of cause and effect. Most disturbing to authorities was not the pitched battles that the Santals fought with the colonial troops, which, after some initial setbacks, the colonial armed forces handily won. But when the Santals were seemingly going about their everyday business, harvesting, mending buildings, hunting, and celebrating. Prior to the insurrection, none of these actions had appeared particularly significant, let alone hostile to the administrators. These practices of everyday life had remained invisible, so to speak. During the rebellion, the colonial authorities suddenly confronted the spectacularism of the Santals every day. They were gathering in large numbers, digging tanks and earthworks, building large storehouses and pavilions to conduct the Hindu festival of Durga Puja, which they normally did not. The problem was that even if these activities were symbolically defined, these could not be sorted out of the normalcy of everyday life to be described as crime. Arrests were futile because no colonial court could punish them. There was scarcely any evidence of overturning authority in the normal acts of carrying axes or celebrating a Brahminical ritual. The everyday entered the colonial archive only when it exceeded its norms and had taken on a particular visible form through magnification of scale. The Santals self-consciously mimicked the formal conventions of the colonial army in organizing their forces and chose to partake in high caste rituals which they did not ordinarily because they were outside the pales of Brahminical society. The Santals were switching cultural codes to assert the form and formality that could be recognizable to colonial authorities. And in that moment of switching codes, their everyday appeared visible. They were speaking in the code of their opponents. They wanted the colonial state to read these acts as insurrectional. Put another way, the Santals were using insurrectionary tactics to create an infrastructure. That is, the material channels that would allow exchange over space. This elicited, further demand to strengthen the very infrastructure that was under attack. Colonial officers and European railway staff in the district asked to have the quote-unquote gaps between the military and civil stations reinforced and urged that the railways and telegraph be extended to military stations to the north without further delay. The impossibility of apprehending the Santals in the situation of the everyday resulted in the administrators demanding martial law in the Santal districts. So what passed as normality could now be viewed as criminality without obstacles posed by a civil court of law. But the need for martial law was also articulated as the necessity of dealing with the Santal as a figure of excessive violence that could erupt without notice. This in turn became the rationale for summary executions and burning of Santal villages as a strategy for quelling the rebellion. Martial law as infrastructure created the legibility that the colonial state needed to define the rebellion. After the rebellion, the entire Damin was reorganized, spatially and administratively, to form a separate non-regulation district, the Santal Parganas. A non-regulation district implied that civil and criminal procedures that governed the rest of the region were held in abeyance in this enclave. Laws and regulations that were applicable to the rest of Bengal were, and I quote, found to be unsuited to so uncivilized a race. Authority over this non-regulation district was vested in a deputy commissioner with 4 assistants, all vested with civil as well as criminal jurisdiction. The justification suggested that the complex procedural formality of colonial English law was to be abandoned in favor of a more informal, paternalistic relation between the district commissioner and the tribal Santals. The solution then was not to strengthen the formal infrastructure of the colonial judiciary for the benefit of the Santals to enable them to access the system, but to remove them farther from it. The Santal Parganas, as a space of exception, constituted one more of a series of spatial dislocation for the Santals. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the Santal Parganas became the prime catchment area for supplying coolie labor to tea plantations in the Northeast. It is not a coincidence that the tea plantations in the Western Duars and Darjeeling were non-regulation tracts as well, an important condition that allowed the planters to regulate, without the intervention of the judiciary, the mobility and working conditions of the laborers. This kind of practice was not atypical, and we find it repeated in the Sepoy Rebellion and scores of other insurrections before and after. Each event, however, has its own peculiar speciality. Next, I want to turn to the infrastructural role of martial law evidenced in the maps that accompanied the Hunter Committee report of 1920, convened to inquire into the disturbances in the western and northern provinces of India between March and May 1919. The disorders, as they were referred to, followed the enactment of the Rowlatt Act in 1919 that indefinitely extended the emergency measures of the Defense of India Act 1915, put in place after the First World War. This included arrest without warrant, indefinite detention, imprisonment without trial, and judicial review. The act reaffirmed the colonial state's right to contain the Indian population from freely moving around. And among its many clauses, it allowed the creation of new categories of offense. Now, matters came to a head when Mohandas Gandhi was prevented from leaving the Bombay presidency. He left anyway, and on attempting to enter the Punjab province, was arrested. Protests erupted in small and large towns, and the Punjab was effectively placed under military control. The Hunter Committee was convened following the public outrage over military killings in Jallianwala Bagh, in Amritsar, and other locations in the Punjab. So what I have for you here is a short timeline from what happened between March 18, 1919, and April 14, 1919, the declaration of martial law. Please note, and I'm going to refer to this again, is that the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh happened the day before. Now, this included the dropping of bombs in Gujranwala Bagh, because it would have taken too long for the troops to arrive by rail. And I want you to note that this is Gujranwala Bagh, this is Amritsar, Lahore. I'm going to make references to these three cities. And this is one of the maps that was produced by the Hunter Committee that accompanied the Hunter Committee report. And they're very interesting in terms of what they show about infrastructure. So the map of Gujranwala Bagh, for example, actually shows where bombs were dropped, where telegraph wires were cut, sites that were looted and burnt. So it's perhaps difficult for you to read them. The green dots here are sites that were burnt, and these were locations where bombs were dropped. Now, the debate in the Hunter Committee was also about the necessity of martial law and the status, extent, and force of military occupation of the districts in Punjab vis-a-vis civil authorities before martial law was declared on April 14th. And I quote, because there is a real distinction between military assistance to civil authority and de facto martial law. The former is an application of force to effectuate the ordinary law in a limited respect and upon particular occasion. The latter takes many rights and liberties away and substitutes a new form of administration. One important point here was that Jallianwala Bagh massacre again took place before the declaration of martial law. The opinion passed by the majority of British members was that the unrest was in the nature of a rebellion against British administration, and thereby the imposition of martial law was necessary, and therefore the killings that happened in towns such as Amritsar and Gujranwala were unfortunate but justified. In commenting on the status of martial law, they remarked, it is quite true that in the course of the 12th, the position was hardening into de facto martial law. In other words, they really wanted to see martial law as already in effect by the 12th. The minority opinion by the three Indian members read the same documents contrarily and argued that it was not a rebellion, which presumes premeditation and organized action, and that the invocation and extension of martial law was unjustified. We can't get into the details of the events here, but it suffices to say that the debate was about what constitutes rebellion and whether the colonial state in this case was indeed faced with a rebellion. The maps of the Punjab were intended to provide the grounds for arguing this was a rebellion, noting the locations where telegraph wire was cut by protesters and the location of arson, murder, and other outrages. Notice the language in this reference here. The offenses include the king burning the king emperor's, destruction of king emperor's photo. The map of Amritsar that was produced specified locations where Europeans were assaulted or killed. And these were marked by a red cross. Okay. You'll have a hard time from where you are sitting actually locating these because they're actually few and far in between. As a text of counterinsurgency, the assault on Europeans and on government buildings and the sites of proclamation of military rule were served up as the infrastructure of rebellion, the evidence of a besieged government. What it didn't show was how many Indians died in the conflict between April 10th and April 13th. Importantly, General Dyer's decision to gun down an unarmed gathering at Jallianwala Bagh was not specifically indicated. Dyer noted, "I fired and continued to fire until the crowd dispersed. And I consider this is the least amount of firing which would have produced the necessary moral and widespread effect it was my duty to produce if I was to justify my action. If more troops had been at hand, the casualties would have been in greater proportion. It was no longer a question of merely dispersing the crowd, but one of producing a sufficient moral effect from a military point of view. Not only those who were present, but more especially throughout the Punjab. There could be no question of undue severity." Rather than the military action that presupposed rebellion, in a circuitous logic, became the evidence of rebellion on the ground. The Minority Report attempted to delineate the limits of necessity and arrived at the conclusion that martial law was not simply what we would now call a tool of biopolitics, but a tool of the biosocial, intended on demarcating the rulers from the ruled. They did not produce a countermap, but condemned Dyer's argument that the killing was necessary to produce a moral lesson. A nominal modification of that map might give a different sense of the modality of civil and military infrastructure in the way they reciprocate each other and set up an intimacy between the biosocial and the biospatial under authoritarian rule. And all I have done here is actually inserted where the killings happened. In other words, adding just another layer of information to the map that was produced. And this is not merely about the fact that hundreds of Indians were killed against a handful of Europeans. It's not just the numbers. It was about how the city was reimagined and represented to argue the problem of a besieged state. Thank you.
Thank you, Shati. This is amazing presentation, and I can't wait. I have a question for you, but I will post it at the end. So Deljana, are you ready?
Thank you, Fadi. Let me attempt this.
Yes.
Okay, you can see.
Yes,
Brilliant.
Yes.
Good. So in this talk, I will be thinking through the notion of infrastructuring as the transformative agency of complex infrastructural formations. I will be using the registers of urban form as spatiality, everyday life, and at the very end, very briefly, speak about longer term development trajectories to demonstrate the violent agency of the project of infrastructuring. So while drawing together ideas from across the humanities and social sciences, I may refer occasionally to concepts and frameworks in ecology and complexity. So the questions that I ask have been asked before. What is the proper amount of skepticism with which to consider the infrastructures that shape our lives? When are we justified in decrying the intrusions of infrastructure, and when ought we to defend the progress it does sometimes represent? When is it necessary to demand the extension of infrastructure to those whom it does not presently reach? My question is, what is infrastructure? Infrastructures are the invisible structures that are created intentionally or unintentionally to sustain or improve human life. Naturally, I draw here on Starr's well-rehearsed conceptualization of infrastructure as material, practiced, and relational. Simone proposes the notion of people as infrastructure to further depart from the materially constrained view that we have grown used to. For him, the provisional intersections of residence in the engagement with complex combinations of objects, spaces, persons, and practices become infrastructure. The more accustomed notion of social infrastructure brings together the physical and institutional infrastructures fundamental to evolving social life. Social infrastructures may not be critical to human life, in contrast to water and energy infrastructures, for instance. However, they are instrumental to the collective life of cities. The infrastructural formations I discuss here do include material objects, various kinds of resources, people, and the more than human ecological systems across different scales. Such infrastructural formations are necessarily dynamic. Changes in one element will trigger and result in changes in another and across the wider system. As such, infrastructural formations underpin, facilitate, and shape urban form, everyday life, and future trajectories. They have structuring agency. Infrastructural formations are easiest traced starting with material objects. Interventions in physical infrastructures will lead to changes in spatial patterns and patterns of everyday life, thus altering social relations and human-environment relationships and possibly reinstituting existing injustices. It is these injustices that are of interest here. They are the byproduct and outcome of infrastructuring as violence. So what do I mean by violence? Violence is first and foremost experienced, embodied, and deeply personal, and I quote here Tyner and Inwood. It must therefore be studied in its particular social, geographical, and temporal context, rather than being understood as universal. Useful conceptualizations have been offered, for instance, by Galton's formulation stemming from the 1960s, where he distinguished direct violence, whereby resources are outright destroyed, from indirect violence, which he conceptualizes as withholding of resources. Structural violence, he suggests, is presented when resources are monopolized by a group or class or are used for other purposes. He also proposes social injustice as an alternative notion, as it is already firmly rooted in our political vocabulary. More recently, and again Tyner and Inwood argue that concrete forms of structural violence, such as the lack of critical infrastructure, are not merely negative externalities. They are, in their words, the results of particular social relations that constitute the production, circulation, and exchange of capitalism. Infrastructure is of special importance here in that it plays a critical role in the distribution of scarce resources, a central theme in the political economy of cities. In this presentation, I will examine the violence of infrastructuring in the case of China's recent and ongoing urban transformation. What we are seeing in China now is the imposition of capitalist forms of infrastructural production and resource distribution that result in concrete forms of structural violence. This infrastructuring violence perpetuates and amplifies already existing inequalities across human and environmental categories. I come here to urban form and the ways in which spatial patterns are transformed with the introduction of new infrastructural systems, and possibly vice versa. New urban morphology demands new infrastructural systems. The implementation of physical infrastructure, i.e. the act of infrastructuring, is a transformative act. It disrupts existing spatial form and can transform the urban landscape through the digging up of streets, widening of roads, demolition of existing urban fabric, and so on and so on. Consider the energy that goes into laying cables, for instance, in digging up streets, in placing objects into the ground. Such acts can be thought as violence, where they disrupt individuals and communities in fulfilling their potential, as we would have it, or prevent them from doing so altogether. So I want to dive here deep into the ground and start with the example of Lawang and the uprising in a neighborhood within which I worked for a while in Shanghai several years ago. I met old Wang some 15 years ago. He kept the door to his house always open. He's clearly visible here as he shakes his large pan on the kitchen fire, fueled by the gas container beneath it. His house is surrounded by rubble, It is one of the last homes standing. The others have long gone. They have been demolished to make space for the construction works due to begin soon. Lao Wang was born there in the 1960s as the fourth child of parents who had migrated to Shanghai from the countryside to run a tea house. In his late teens, he, like many of his generation, was imprisoned on several occasions for minor transgressions. He spent time in the countryside as part of a large government initiative at the time. He finally found work back in the city in a local factory, of course, a state-owned enterprise. However, his company, like many others at this time, faced financial difficulties due to industrial restructuring and increased competition from an emerging private sector. Old Wang was laid off in 1989. Granted a minimum monthly subsistence payment, he has, excuse me, back. This is why I'm keeping my camera off. My computer is doing strange things today. I apologize. So Wang, he has been in and out of work ever since the early 1990s. The close links with neighbors he developed over those last decades emerged from activities such as cooking at home, eating together with neighbors, playing cards, and playing mahjong to kill time, as he has it. Old Wang worked on expanding the house he had inherited from his parents to accommodate members of the extended family. They all had problems with their jobs. They held low-paid jobs or were unemployed altogether. Early in 2004, the district government presented residents of Old Wang's neighborhood with redevelopment plans. This had been long awaited. However, it also took some serious negotiations. The contrast between the dilapidated neighborhood and the newly mushrooming commodity housing around it had already become increasingly obvious. Soon, the relocation company in charge of resident resettlement would set up an office on site and start work. Old Wang and his family learned that they were assigned resettlement housing in compensation for their home. The apartments would be located some 20 to 40 kilometers away from central Shanghai, where they were currently living. After his first visit to the future apartment, Old Wang became worried about the lack of infrastructure that he encountered. No public transportation, no shops, no healthcare facilities. What about his wife's job? He says, "Our jobs," and I quote here, "will be too far away to reach and too expensive to maintain after the move. So what will we do? We will probably lose them and we will have to find new ones in a place with nothing to be found." While most neighbors made quick deals with the relocation company, hastily moved away and were often replaced by migrants who were squatting in abandoned homes, Old Wang continued to negotiate the conditions of his and his extended family's relocation with representatives of the relocation company. After an episode in which the representatives of the relocation company waited at his doorstep every day for 2 weeks in a row, attempting to talk him into leaving, Old Wang signed a preliminary compensation agreement. He settled for 2 apartments, the bigger one for him, because after all, he had built the house, the smaller for his brother, and some cash in addition. The uneven compensation, however, caused a serious rift between him and the rest of his family. Old Wang had moved into temporary accommodation in the vicinity of his new apartment by 2008. His new apartment building was still under construction. He had indeed lost his job, so had his wife, because the long commute to the inner city no longer paid off. Old buildings in his old neighborhood were demolished on the 31st of December 2007. Approximately 1,000 residents were displaced to resettlement housing outside the city. Residents in the surrounding residential compounds were led to believe that demolition and displacement happened in view of the site's redevelopment into a lovely neighborhood park. They were quite concerned, they were quite content with this prospect. However, following the appearance of a workers' dormitory on and hoarding around the site, in June 2008, the Shanghai Planning Authority posted a notice which, to nearby residents' unpleasant surprise, informed them of the impending construction of 2 power substations in place of Old Wang's neighborhood. They would supply electricity to a metro and a metro station, which was at this point already under construction. The substations were to be located in a distance of less than 16 meters from nearby residential buildings, 4 meters less than the distance required by law. Initially worried about the potential impact of power substations on their health, with time residents became increasingly concerned with the potential effect they may also have on the value of their properties. Many of them had invested all of their life savings to buy apartments in the area. So, on the closing night of the Olympics in 2008, and despite voicing their concerns with government across multiple levels, they took to the streets. 200 residents spontaneously gathered on the street in protest and blocked traffic for 40 minutes, hoping to attract the attention of international media in support of their case. Police dispelled the protest and used loudspeakers to discourage people from further action during the days to follow. The construction, of course, continued. During the following couple of weeks, local government representatives knocked on residents' doors, took details, discouraged them from attempting any further protests, especially from affixing banners to windows and walls of residential buildings. Meanwhile, in October, the 2 power substations finally received actual official approval. Nearly 100 residents from neighboring residential compounds gathered to discuss the situation and spontaneously collected money to buy a large tent, which they pitched on the ground of the construction site. They organized for the provision of food and other equipment. For 2 weeks in a row, residents stood guard in shifts around the clock. I quote here one of the residents who participated. We came together from all compounds to discuss the situation. The old people volunteered to sit guard. The younger ones were at work. They didn't want to inconvenience the younger ones. They didn't want to prevent them from finding work in the future. In particular, the grandchildren were to be protected so that they could get jobs and places at university. The old people stood guard even during the nights. Whenever the construction workers tried to start their work, they started striking the large gong, so all the neighbors would hear and would come down to stop them. This went on, but then one night the police came. In the night of November 3rd, more than 1,000 so-called Mingong, those are people, this is how people from the countryside are called, who, and I quote here again, are less educated, rough and dirty, and work at construction sites. So those Mingong, about 1,000 of them, and 500 police officers arrived on site with the goal to force the protesters from their base, the tent. And I quote again, it was a horrible sight. First, they built a wall around the construction site and the fence so that people could not see what was going on inside. Old people were kneeling on the ground everywhere, crying for help and asking the police to have mercy on them, to stop. On November 4th, whoever was identified as more active and hence considered a leader in this movement was arrested and detained for at least 24 hours, scaring protesters away from further action. The Mingong stayed in the area for at least 2 weeks. They were dressed like civilians and listened in on people's conversations. Whenever residents dared to speak about the events, they were immediately reported to the local government or police. Needless to say, obviously, today the 2 beautiful power substations are hidden behind leafy trees in a park where locals rarely set foot. When I meet old Wang again, he had just suffered a stroke. Sitting on the terrace outside his sister's apartment, he looks older, more fragile. The doors and windows are opened, and I can see his brother-in-law preparing food in the back. It is unclear just how many people live in his flat. The story of old Wang's displacement is hurtful also because of the irony attached to the role of transport infrastructure here. Before his stroke, he regularly made the 45 minutes of a metro journey to his former neighborhood to walk the now unfamiliar streets with old friends. The very infrastructure that displaced him and his neighbors now serves as a lifeline for maintaining their connection. So in rupturing existing spatial form on this larger scale, infrastructuring, of course, intervenes in social relations and often in the human-environment relationship. In displacing communities from the city center to the urban fringes, it breaks up neighborhood links. Violence here is the violence of urbanization, which rapidly and radically transforms cities in introducing massive infrastructure mega projects into social spatial environments, thereby expelling and marginalizing already disadvantaged populations and destroying fragile ecosystems in the process. As Graham argues in the Postmortem City, civilian urban planning, development, modernization, and restructuring often actually involve levels of devastation of cities, ruination, and forced resettlement that match that which occurs in an all-out war. The attacks on the city and the urban air are indeed constructed from the global project to develop territory, to plan space and eliminate particularities, directly contradicting the right to shelter and mobility. And I move here to patterns of everyday life, which are structured by human infrastructure interactions. In the simplest of terms, infrastructure determines where, when, and how everyday social practices occur. Or in the words of Yaffa and O'Reilly, who we have here today, processes of decay, maintenance, and repair of infrastructure in an urban context may alter not only the material form of infrastructure, but also change the pre-existing social political infrastructure nexus. To illustrate this point, I draw here on the indirect infrastructuring agency of sanitation. How do sanitation infrastructure and associated practices structure patterns of everyday life and, by implication, intimate relations in and across space? Ms. Chang walks the narrow lanes of her neighborhood. She lives with her mother, daughter, brother, sister-in-law, and their children. It would take approximately 90 seconds to get from her house to the neighborhood's waste collection station, where she goes 2 or 3 times per day to empty the family's night pot. On the way, she stops to chat at every open door, exchanging news and gossip, picking up a mandarin here and some biscuit there. Sometimes she walks into a neighbor's house, sitting down for a chat. Ms. Chang's neighborhood was demolished in 2014. It went overnight. For her and her family, it was a long-awaited moment, salvation even. They had been waiting to be resettled, to rid themselves of the dirt, the stink, the overcrowding of the neighborhood. Some of them had actually helped to build. Most had been born there. Today, Ms. Chang lives alone. Her toilet is now conveniently located inside her home. She has the washing machine she always wanted. The lift now takes the 90 seconds that it took to get to the waste collection station to carry her to the ground of the high-rise building. It smells there too, and it is dirty. There are problems with the sewage system, and sometimes sewage is simply pumped into the nearby canals. It smells, Mrs. Chang says. It smells all the time. Mrs. Chang's daughter now lives with her husband in a small flat in one of the posh compounds nearby. To visit, Mrs. Chang has to make a phone call to announce herself, take the lift down, walk out of the compound, cross the busy road, get past the guards and announce herself again, and take another 90 seconds lift right up to her daughter's flat. We can see this is Mrs. Chang's mother with her lifetime friend in their old neighborhood. Mrs. Chang's mother now lives in a home for the elderly on the other side of town. It takes an hour, sometimes more, to get there. I want to mention here briefly, because I always do, just how sanitation acts to marginalize and isolate. The small children of migrants in the city often do not have access to any kind of sanitation. They are left to defecate in the open and punished with stigma and exclusion. Older generations who live in poorer urban neighborhoods are forgotten and abandoned. Their children and grandchildren call, they say, but they don't visit because they no longer wish to practice the sanitation of the past. They demand flush toilets, they demand privacy. In this sense, infrastructuring intervenes in social relations and wider human environment and relationships. And I will briefly come to speak of this in the next few slides, but here I want to stress how everyday lives are shaped by interaction with infrastructural systems as the specific spatio-temporal moment in which people physically engage with one piece of a larger system in one particular location, quote unquote, Angelo and Henschel. It is here at this intersection that infrastructure structures everyday lives through its conditioning, determining, enabling, and disrupting agency. Human infrastructure interactions shape how we think normatively about space and time, how we categorize cities, communities, or individuals. In altering spatial configurations and human and other intimate relations, infrastructuring may produce or reproduce social and environmental injustices in the short and long term. Infrastructuring violence limits the life chances of marginalized social groups today in withholding infrastructure, yet infrastructuring violence amplifies in scale and through time and limits life chances at potentially much larger scale in the long term and in the future. Infrastructuring acts to transform future trajectories in altering patterns of resource extraction and use. In drawing on natural resources for its construction and then maintenance, infrastructure is very intimately woven into ecosystems across multiple scales and acts to condition, determine, enable, and disrupt ecological processes and systems. However, the gradual incremental violence inflicted upon current and future generations in the process of constructing and eventually disassembling or abandoning infrastructural systems remains remarkably discounted for in much of the current critical literature in the field. The simplest example to illustrate this is that of the broken sanitation system in China. Not too long ago, we had a closed loop system whereby food was produced in the countryside, brought to and eaten in the city. Human feces were collected and sold back to farmers to fertilize their fields and produce more food. With the success of the Western idea of waterborne sanitation, this cycle has been broken. People in cities eat food, their feces are flushed into rivers and seas, farmers import chemical fertilizers to grow food, and this carries obvious implications. In combination with the physical transformation of the urban environment, the accumulation and amplification of patterns of human infrastructure interactions in the everyday carry implications for resource extraction and use, the degradation of the natural environment, and ultimately human health and well-being. In this way, infrastructure structures future trajectories. Infrastructuring indeed inflicts violence not only upon current, but also upon future generations through environmental degradation and the diminishing of life chances for people across all social strata in the future. And I wish to end with some sort of a call to arms. I want to argue that infrastructuring is always a form of violence and always involves human actors and the intentional actions. People design, implement, maintain, and withhold infrastructure. In this way, people have agency to shape social relations, spatial form, and other types of human-environment relationships. Infrastructural violence is all but anonymous. Power relationships can be uncovered. Those responsible can be called out. In fact, critical scholarship cannot even afford to suggest that infrastructural violence masks responsibility or accountability. Rogers and O'Neill explicitly argue that the notion of infrastructural violence is helpful for the possibility of providing quote-unquote practical material recommendations that have the potential to improve dramatically the lives of those who are pressed upon by the city. Indeed, infrastructuring limits the life chances of marginalized social groups today in withholding infrastructure and then violently displacing them to the advantage of already privileged groups. But at the same time, infrastructuring limits the life chances of all humans in the future in expanding and entrenching wasteful and unsustainable infrastructure driven by the principles of capitalist expansion. To strike a balance and minimize negative outcomes for society and the environment now and in the future is a difficult balancing act, but I think one that we are intimately responsible for. Thank you.
Thank you, Deljana. Thank you very much for this also interesting presentation. And I'm gonna ask Yaffa to also start her presentation if you're ready.
Great, let me share my screen. Let me just see. Are you seeing the proper screen?
Yes, but
Presenter's view.
you have to put presenter, you're still in presenter's view.
Oh, I see. Okay, 1 second. Sorry about that. Let me do it one more time. Here we go. Share screen. Okay. Is that any better?
No, you're still presenter's view.
Oh, okay, I should be able to swap screens. Hold on. Swap displays. How is that?
Yes, that's it. Thank
Okay, thanks for your patience. Okay, great. I have 2 screens going, so that always gets a little complex. Okay, thanks so much for those really wonderfully rich presentations by Swati and Deljana. And thank you so much, Deljana, for this invitation, and Fadi for moderating this session. And I guess I'm the last speaker before we go to questions. And I'm going to talk today about situating infrastructural violence, bodies, intersectionality, and slow violence in urban India. So the picture that you are seeing on the left is of a woman holding a receipt for a toilet she paid for in the Indore municipality of India. And she, unfortunately, after receiving this receipt for a toilet she purchased, the toilet never came. And several months later, her slum was demolished because there were no toilets. The picture on the right is in Delhi, and it's depicting not sanitation, but a fragmented water supply where tube wells are servicing a community and the tubes stop. And women are actually using their bodies to actually substitute for the lack of pipes to their homes. And so their bodies are kind of filling that infrastructural gap between where the pipe ends and their home begins. Now, in these 2 different sites, and I'm going to be talking about each in this presentation, I'm both interested in these fragmented infrastructural configurations, these partial infrastructures that exist, quote unquote, beyond the network, and are consistently, at least in some of the cities I'm mentioning and studying today, are actually an urban majority experience. And I'm really interested not only in studying these, but today in talking about how they relate to different types of violences, infrastructural violence that emerges around these fragmented networks. I'm drawing on a couple of papers with several wonderful collaborators. The first is a collaboration on indoor sanitation with Kathleen O'Reilly. And the second is not published yet, it's under review with my collaborator, Hanna Ruschek at Durham University on bodies as infrastructure. And she's working on urbanizing Nepal, and I'm working on Delhi, and we're doing sort of a comparison there. So before I kind of get into those case studies, I want to kind of touch a little bit on the theory, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that framework as I get into each case study as well. But to introduce it, Rogers and O'Neill in 2011, I'm sure many of you are familiar with their special issue on infrastructural violence, where they basically kind of go into the concept in a bit more detail. And they say that infrastructural violence consists of structural, instrumental, and even passive forms of violence that are tied to how infrastructures are implemented, regulated, and unequally experienced. And this includes what the other speakers have said today, the socially harmful effects of infrastructure's limitations and omissions as well, not just infrastructure's direct consequences. So they've set a nice kind of framework for thinking of passive and active violence, as Deljana said, structural violence, as well as kind of active violence versus passive, which I just mentioned. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm having trouble getting my slide to move forward. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, in these two case studies, two different lenses for thinking through infrastructural violence, both with sanitation in indoor and with water in Delhi. And the first is infrastructural intersectionality, which is drawing on feminist theorizations of intersectionality and kind of applying them to thinking through infrastructure and violence. And the second is bodies as infrastructure. And I'll get into each of those in a minute. So let's start with the indoor case study. So indoor, basically in 2017, was named, out of 500 Indian cities, was named the cleanest Indian city through something called the Swachh Bharat mission, which many of you might be familiar with. It's a Clean India national mission. We were very curious as researchers, what does it mean to be named the cleanest city of India, and what kind of transformations are happening on the ground in an everyday life for different communities. And one of the main measurements by which this award was given was the city proving that it had universal toilet coverage. In other words, it was open defecation free. There was no need to defecate in the open because other infrastructures were available for sanitation. This is the mayor actually receiving a golden statue of Gandhi when it became the #1 cleanest city in India. And the city actually produced more than 100-page pamphlet to export to other cities about how they could attain the same level of cleanliness. Thinking through this, myself and collaborators thought about how violence is connected to what we're calling infrastructural intersectionality. And in the paper, we actually have a couple of different meanings of infrastructural intersectionality, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on one, which is drawing on feminist theorizations of intersectionality. Many of you might be familiar with Crenshaw's work in 1991 that highlights the complexity of gendered experiences in tension with race, ethnicity, class, age, or sexuality. So rather than gender being fixed or mutually exclusive of other social identities, it's rather shaped through things like race, caste, class, which produce different forms of power and oppression. So we're very interested in getting to sort of the nuances of social differentiation in everyday life and social relations through thinking about these intersections that happen that are shaping people's uneven experiences and vulnerabilities to infrastructure. And because of this, we ultimately show that in becoming India's cleanest city in indoor, both operated through and reproduced intersecting gender, caste, and class relations in the city, and ultimately leveled compounded forms of infrastructural violence on poor, non-dominant caste women's bodies. And I'll talk you through some of that, how that worked. To get into this, I want to first start with a story from the Sukniwas slum, which is an informal settlement primarily consisting of non-dominant caste groups. And they tend to be the last to be able to access or afford latrines within their homes and communities, and in general constitute a higher proportion of the urban poor. Lower non-dominant caste women were actually approached by the municipality to buy into a scheme through the Swachh Bharat mission to purchase toilets so they could have access to in-home toilets. They had to pay around 1,200 rupees for this, and the state would subsidize the rest of the costs. So in November 2016, the municipal corporation entered the slum as part of the mission. It found 40 dwellings that lacked access to latrines, and it basically gave receipts, as you see in this photo and in the beginning of my presentation, that toilets had been purchased and toilets would be coming to the slum. Unfortunately, a few months later in January 2017, disaster struck. The officials returned, and instead of putting in toilets, They came with 8 police and actually stated that houses without toilets would be leveled to the ground in a demolition. Although there were pits for the toilet structures that had been dug, there were no toilets. And as narrated by Nanjubai, who experienced this, she said, the municipality officials began knocking at our doors at 6 a.m. and asked us all to step out immediately. We were asked to either save our lives or our belongings. We chose our lives. In no time, all our belongings were crushed. Our houses were razed to the ground and we were made homeless. Now, of course, as researchers, we wanted to understand why would the municipality have folks that they had receipts for toilets purchased actually demolish homes that were waiting for toilets. And this, as we dug deeper, we discovered it was part of the Swatchbart mission in the municipality itself had decided to become open defecation free. It needed to prove that if you were to survey the landscape, and this is exactly what happened, surveyors came in from the central government. If you were to survey the city, you would not find informal settlements where there were no toilets. And unfortunately, because the municipality had not installed the toilets soon enough and the survey was about to happen, they demolished the areas that did not have toilets in order to erase them from being counted and in order to prove that, in fact, sanitation was available for those houses that were visible. Of course, this is one of the most extreme forms of violence that you can see very much tying into what Deljana discussed in her presentation. But beyond just demolition, the situated approach to thinking through infrastructural violence, we found that new forms of policing sanitation through what was called swachagaris produced new power geometries that empowered predominantly dominant caste men and middle class and upper class men to police the bodies of non-dominant caste and poorer women. And this basically happened because swachagaris were citizen groups that the municipality empowered to give fines to and to report when they saw open defecation. And open defecation in indoor was the most obvious and the most visible when it occurred by women, because mostly women were going out in groups, they were easier to spot, and they were the ones that were consistently policed and also described consistent harassment when they would try to go to the bathroom. Part of the swachagaris was what was termed dibba gangs. This is, again, groups of men that are holding, you can see these sort of yellow, they're called small drums that basically get beaten. So you beat the drum when you see someone open defecating. And again, this was used as a tool oftentimes to harass women, to shame them for open defecating, and basically putting the blame on women's bodies as dirtying and polluting the city, instead of looking at the structural constraints in the first place that did not provide women with any feasible sanitation options in the first place. Another picture, I'll get to the next picture, but this institutionalization of gendered harassment and shaming was actually something that was made very visible and open by the municipality. So the additional commissioner of the municipality was sort of bragging about these tactics. And he said, there's not just the dibba gang, we have the whistle gang, the mic gang as well. They work in the same routine. If they see people defecating in the open, they shout and embarrass them. Our motto is to change the behavior. Again, ignoring the structural violence where open defecation is made as the only option in the first place. Another tactic that was used were spot fines. And this message on the wall in the back of this picture says, quote, those who defecate in the open will have to pay a 500 rupees fine and will be excluded from other government programs. Really a blame and shame campaign. And by the way, many of these pictures were exported by the municipality themselves as part of the model of what other cities can do in India to become the cleanest city. So in essence, what we show in the paper is that these different tactics and the infrastructural violence of actual demolition coupled with these different tactics had very explicit connotations across intersecting gender, caste, and class groups. And so there was a situated infrastructural violence that particularly non-dominant caste groups experienced, particularly women and particularly working class groups, had a disproportionate brunt of. And it included an increased visibility and scrutiny of women's bodies. It included creating unsafe spaces, as if open defecation wasn't challenging enough, because women frequently face harassment anyway, but this increased visibility added another level of stress, strain, sometimes financial hardship because of fines leveled, and exclusion to other government programs. And of course, it changed the discourse about who's responsible for sanitation and cleaning a city in the first place, and who's responsible for dirtying the city. Okay, I'm gonna now turn to my second case study, which is thinking about fragmented water in Delhi. And in this case, the way that we understand some modalities of infrastructural violence and bring visibility to them is to try to think through the concept of bodies as infrastructure as a way to understand different dimensions of infrastructural violence. So to give a little bit of background, what does this mean, body as infrastructure? It's not quite the same as people as infrastructure that Simone talks about, that's more about social networks of support and economic networks. But what we're talking about is actually thinking of physical bodies as almost a prosthetic, to the grid, that the body itself is substituting for spaces in which the grid is absent, in which the grid is fragmented, in which the grid is partial. And this seeks to first, of course, extend the scholarship, this rich scholarship that already exists on infrastructures being both material and cultural, social and technical. And we're also kind of drawing on Larkin here, who argues that rather than what constitutes an infrastructure being predetermined and intuitive, he argues that the act of defining something as an infrastructure is a categorizing moment that brings particular aspects of an infrastructure into view while potentially obviating others. So as infrastructure can be found on multiple scales within the city and obviously beyond it, we understand that defining an infrastructure is a political act that focuses attention on certain aspects of infrastructure while ignoring others. And it's precisely because bodies are not conventionally understood to comprise infrastructure, that their roles and tasks like hauling water, providing networks of support in neighborhoods, or participating in financial networks of exchange, for example, they don't surface in policy planning and mainstream narratives of how resources and networks function to build cities. That the role of the body in critical urban networks is often made invisible and overlooked. In bringing attention to this, we're kind of drawing on, and I won't go into a lot of detail here, but happy to talk about it later, some feminist political geography. And in the words of Mounts, feminist political geography has long centered the body as subject and object of analysis through which to understand how power acts spatially in the world to control. And feminist geographic thought has reformulated the body as an active site by which wider processes become collapsed and experienced in the everyday, and by which differing forms of political engagement occur. So ultimately, we're arguing that conceptualizing the body as infrastructure opens up analytical space to consider the politics at hand and these mundane practices of the body as it engages in infrastructural labor, care, and social work, and how it can actually reveal different dimensions of both active and passive forms of violence experienced by women. And when we're talking about violence, we particularly want to bring attention towards the idea of a slow infrastructural violence, mostly not because we don't see active and structural forms of violence and we don't talk about them in our work, but because this slow violence is harder to see and harder to track, and it goes on for years. And the body's acting as infrastructure in an everyday way by, in this case, hauling water, transporting it, finding it, moving it, negotiating. These are everyday practices that often don't appear violent on the surface, but they rob people of life hours. They bring on harm to the body through physical exhaustion, through injuries. There's the issue of contaminated water. Of course, it's always being navigated. So there are many issues that come together over a span of time that produce something that might be more akin to a slow infrastructural violence that Nixon describes as occurring gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. And this includes the violence of social orderings. And in particular, in this case, of course, women are, through gender roles and gendered labor, are tasked with being the primary responsible parties for finding water for their households. And so because of these kind of social patriarchal hierarchies, we start to see how that slow violence kind of seeps in through those in everyday practice. To give a little bit of context of why the urban majority in Delhi might be acting as infrastructure through their bodies, and yet it doesn't really surface in policy documents, and you don't really see those stories coming out as how water is actually circulated. I want to give a little brief overview of what's going on with the general water supply in Delhi and why is it so fragmented. So this is a map that the Delhi Water Board itself has produced that shows all of the raw water sources coming into Delhi. And if you take the aggregate amount of water entering the city and you divide it by the population, you get about 200 liters of water per person per day, which is pretty high. It's roughly double London, for example. And it's the highest of all Asian cities. And so technically there should be quantity-wise sufficient water flowing through the city. If you scratch beneath the surface, though, two contradictions immediately surface. The first is about 50% of the population is not legally eligible, officially eligible for a piped connection, at least 50%. And that's because of this clause that the Delhi Jal Board, the water board, is not required to provide premises with water if they've been constructed in contravention to any law. And in practice, this excludes informal settlements because they are deemed to be in contravention to the law. More than 50% of the population lives in some type of informal settlement in the city and doesn't have an official right to access a piped connection of water in their homes. The other contradiction that immediately surfaces with Delhi's overall water story is that after water flows through treatment plants, about 50% of it disappears. And no one really knows where it goes. There's a lot of controversy around it. Often the urban poor are blamed for water leaks. There may be water exchanges under the table, but at any rate, 50% is lost. So we're getting not accounted for. So we're getting to a much smaller amount of water that's accounted for flowing through the city. But even for connected households, and again, you're seeing a map that's produced by the Delhi Water Board, even if you are in the roughly 50% that gets piped water, you'll see that there's vast inequalities in terms of how much water each neighborhood gets. And water only flows around 2 hours a day. Some days it's absent altogether. So this in essence means that even if you have a piped connection, someone in the household, and typically it is a gendered role that women have to play disproportionately, has to piece together the fact that water may not have be flowing that day. It has to be stored when it is flowing. Pumps have to be turned on. All kinds of activities have to happen to make sure the household has water. So it's not something that even connected households are free of doing. But I won't be talking about them quite as much today for the sake of time. If you do not have a piped water connection in the city, water in essence is made to flow through a variety of practices and labor. And this is primarily done by gendered, classed, and casted bodies that serve to ultimately subsidize the grid. And it's not just the labor and the care, although that's quite important. It's quite a bit of negotiations and problem solving. And some of the folks in this photo, particularly the men that happen to be in these pictures, are in one way or another in control of some type of technology or water flow in their neighborhoods and have to be negotiated with in order to get these technologies and these flows. So the slow violence of bodies working as a replacement for absent or defunct infrastructure is shaped by these power relations. And certainly that kind of situated understanding of who's actually responsible for circulating water for the urban majority has been dropped from visibility. And hence, that's why we're trying to bring more attention to what these bodies actually do and whose bodies do this work. To give it a bit more grounding and context, I want to show a few slides from a informal settlement where I've worked for more than a decade. And so I've been able to kind of track some of the changes that have happened with their fragmented supply. Rampur camp in Delhi. And I'll talk a little, I won't have a lot of time, but I'll talk a little bit about, you might be seeing from the left side versus the right side of these pictures that there's more infrastructure. You can sort of see there's a little bit more of paved lanes, garbage being picked up, pakka kind of established houses on the left side versus the right side. And this is important because the left side is a predominantly Hindu area of the settlement and the right side is a predominantly Muslim area. And you can see that the infrastructure is much worse on the Muslim area and that they've suffered basically a systemic discrimination, not only by the state, when officials and politicians come and deliver infrastructures, they bypass that side of the settlement. And I also tracked NGOs doing something similar. And so you also don't see many people on the pictures on the right. And that's because that side of the settlement is predominantly men that have migrated to Delhi by themselves and left their families in rural Bihar. And so you're not really seeing family life kind of going on that side, and you're not seeing bodies because men tend to be at work. This all becomes even more relevant when thinking through the violences of these fragmented infrastructures, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. One of the primary sources of getting water for the settlement has been erratic tanker deliveries that are delivered by the state at the state's discretion. They may or may not show up daily. By the way, the Muslim side of the settlement got a smaller tanker. They had separate tankers and it was smaller than the predominantly Hindu side of the settlement. So you're seeing a difference already right there. And what happens is when available, it typically is women that are going to try to haul this water, to collect this water, that are spending hours of time waiting for this water, often missing work opportunities, or sometimes, and I think you might be able to sort of see in this picture, some young girls are also involved in this. They're pulled out of school so they can help with the water labor, or they're pulled out of school to go work in homes so their mothers don't have to work and their mothers can stay back and give the time to water that's needed. All of these water practices, by the way, Zara referred to as in the year 2000, quite a while ago, as compensation practices in Delhi. And she actually estimated in the year 2000 that the worth of all of these practices to compensate for the state's lack of reliable water totaled about 3 billion each year, which at the time, 3 billion rupees, sorry, each year. And at the time was twice the municipality's own expenditure on its water supply. So just some pictures of the stress of waiting for water. This day, actually, I was tracking, the tanker never came. And people waited about 3 hours before just deciding, okay, I don't think the tanker is going to come today. Went home without water and then had to problem solve, well, where will I get my water today? And for some of these women that I talked to, they went to homes that they cleaned across the street. It was a middle-class colony, and they asked their employers for a bucket of water and tried to negotiate it that way. I've mentioned the stress and strain of transporting water. I would just say that not only is this emotionally taxing work, but physically very few people do have a bicycle like you see pictured here. And it can take up to 20 minutes to walk between where a tanker arrives and where a home might be. And of course, some of these water canisters are really just too heavy to lift. So it becomes quite an impossible task with a lot of bodily injuries and wear and tear. On arriving back at home, we see that managing water is also an all-consuming kind of daily task. And you see different buckets here with different types of water. Of course, if the household was able to obtain potable water, they try to keep that separate. If there's another source of water that's more contaminated, it might be saline, it might be groundwater. Those are also kept separate, and you have to kind of go between the two and be very careful about how to conserve. This brings me to this second, and I'm going to wrap this up in a couple minutes because I think I'm almost at time, but the second kind of main source of water in this community was a tube well that was put in place. After I'd been researching a couple of years, I came back and this tube well was put in place that would draw groundwater on site. And many people said, oh, great, this is, especially women, were saying this will alleviate our burden of waiting for water all day long because we can just access it via the tube well. And without going into all the complexities, what you're seeing in this picture is a women's group that was supposed to be kind of in charge of the tube well that was put together in the community. But unfortunately, on the right side, you're seeing a picture. The man in the white kurta is the Pradhan, which is a local chieftain, an informal leader of the area. Because of his political ties with the local NGO, as well as with the local municipal councilor, he was able to obtain the key to the motor of the tube well, the thing that starts the tube well and gets it running. And he was able to then dictate who would get water in what lanes at what times. And he tended to favor the few Brahmin families that were living in the settlement were close to him. So he tended to favor their lane, their spigot that was closer to their house. And what you're seeing here, a group of Dalit women that were saying basically very difficult to get water in their lane. Sometimes it would only be turned on by the local leader, for 5 minutes a day. Sometimes he wouldn't turn it on at all. So they were hustling when he did turn it on. And the right-hand picture is one of the sons of these women who went to the leader to complain that there's no water in our lane and my mothers aren't able to get water. And unfortunately, this child was attacked after launching that complaint by a group of men that's associated with the local leader. So some other kind of more overt forms, of course, of violence surfacing around these fragmented supplies. To hear from the community itself, one woman says, there are fights every day. Some people get water while others don't. The flow of this lane is minimal as well. However, the flow of the other lane is better. So we're seeing, again, some of those different dynamics of caste privilege playing out with who's getting water. Another woman saying, okay, now we have water, but we can't drink it because of the salinity. And she's saying, really what we need is pipelines from the city. On the Muslim side of the settlement, which again, I don't have a lot of time to go into, we see a very different kind of gendered water role because of the absence of women on this side of the settlement. Men had to take on the typically feminized role of hauling water. And because you could see them doing this, particularly in the evenings, they would work 12-hour shifts. They would come back. They had missed the tanker delivery because of working on a construction site. They would then come back, not have water, have to buy water outside the settlement or do a 2-kilometer walk to a neighboring settlement that was willing to extend them some of their tube well water because they couldn't get it in their own settlement. You see this reversal of gendered roles that becomes much more visible, this disruption. We often talk about infrastructure being disrupted, and when it's disrupted, it becomes visible. But here, these infrastructural practices become reversed and disrupted. And then we kind of understand, I think it becomes more visible how different bodies are acting as infrastructure at different moments in time. Quickly, I'll read one of the quotes indicating the systemic discrimination of that side of the settlement. One male Muslim resident said, it's been a very long time that we've lived here, around 15 to 20 years, and still there's no development on this side, while there is a lot on the other, because most of the people here are Muslims, and also the Pradhan, the leader, is there on the other side, meaning he's also a Hindu resident. One resident complains that the circumstances of his water is so severe that he doesn't even manage to have enough water to cook food, which is one of the most severe complaints I ever heard of anyone I interviewed in that area. He said we have to go outside to eat, obviously spending their income on food in a more difficult way, so they can't save as much. Forget about bathing and washing, it's very difficult. Okay, so I'm just gonna conclude that what I've tried to do is use two different lenses in these case studies, both infrastructural intersectionality and bodies as infrastructure, in order to think through different avenues in which infrastructural violence is affecting everyday life in the Indian cities that I've been studying. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yaffa.
And I'll just stop my share. Sorry, my mouse is not behaving, but I will get it too.
It's okay. I wanna take this opportunity to actually thank all our three presenters for this rich and really super rich empirical, not only theoretical engagement with the idea of violence and infrastructure, but this rich empirical these rich empirical examples, whether we are looking at historical examples or more recent contemporary ones. And I want to ask everyone, please, to type in your questions. In the meantime, I'll just maybe give a brief recap and pause something general to reflect on, but please type your questions in the chat if you have any questions for our panelists. We had a good start. We started with 3 attendees, and we came down a little bit to 21 attendees, but that's still, in the world of Zoom, is that's something good. I want to say that as much as all these presentations look a little bit different, one is more about an older case, or one is more about the military, one is more about civilian, or is more about eviction. But I found that there are the interesting threads between these presentations, although not all the presentations name it as such. But the interesting common threads is, well, first it starts from violence as our baseline, as a default for everything. The difference is, because it's a baseline for everything, it ends up obviously affecting those who are at the lower end of the ladder, and those who are already in a dire condition. But even the act of digging up the soil or the dirt to just pave a road as an act of violence eventually ends up affecting those at the end of the ladder. The other thing is, we noticed in all these presentations that I think this is what Shati just pointed out in the beginning about the fact that infrastructure is always seen as this bound spatiality. But we've noticed throughout the presentations that actually, yes, it is actually more decentralized as an idea, and not only as an idea, but as the artifacts, as the material things themselves that create these networks. So the body becomes entrenched in the whole infrastructural network. The jerry cans, the tanks, the weapons, the eviction, the building, the latrines, everything becomes part of this infrastructuring. Now, somebody might want to debate whether we call this infrastructure or not, but it's definitely part of a larger infrastructuring practice. And one last thing that I want to just say, it reminded me of this concept that I read about once from Rob Nixon. It's called attritional lethality. And we see how what you called slow violence is actually, like in the military case, obviously, because the military are, is an institution or an agency that intervenes right away. So the violence, it's much more visible. But in general, the whole colonial practice or the whole class or gendered practice is also always committing this kind of attritional violence. So it's almost like an attrition, it might even remind us of other more clear aspects, like what's happening in Palestine, Israel right now. But again, also at the level of the everyday collecting water, we could see this attritional thing. We could see how people in China are kicked out from their houses, and they lose their cultural connection in that sense. So I'm gonna stop there. If you wanna add to this or reflect on this, please be my guest. Otherwise, I don't think we have questions so far. And I know some of you might have to leave early, so also please feel free to leave whenever you have to.
Can I quickly, just possibly a very naive question, but since I'm always interested in interventions, what can we do? What can we learn? What can we learn from the kind of very explicit violence that happened a century ago in India and is continuing to happen possibly because of very much related reasons and slightly transformed, but very much similar structural faults, if you like. How do we intervene? I read recently suggestions that because of COVID-19, emergency/humanitarian access should be provided to sanitation, to slum settlements to have access to water and sanitation. How can we even conceptualize this as humanitarian or as an emergency situation, even in the context of COVID-19? I mean, those are clearly, I'm walking around my question here and I'm not entirely sure how to formulate it. So I just wonder, how can we intervene in the year 2021? How can we abolish this kind of idea that some people deserve and others don't? How can we get rid of selective distribution of scarce resources? How can we intervene in the elimination of certain bodies to the advantage of others? What needs to be done, and how can we do that from our position as academics rather than activists? Is there anything that we can do at all?
Let me jump in and try to respond to that question, because I also have to leave a little earlier before 10 my time. Let's take, Yaffa's presentation, or what you were doing, talking about Deljana, and I'm thinking about the sort of similarities. For me, what connects all of these is that we're using infrastructure as a lens to understand social inequity, okay? So you cannot fix it by infrastructural means, okay? It is the structure, it is about Dalits, it is about tribals, it is about Hindu-Muslim inequity. That is where the root, so in other words, one of the things that frustrates me, and the reason I even started working on my last book, Unlearning the City, is because, in those early 2000s, when he was like, we just need infrastructure. I'll tell you what you need. Infrastructure, all problems will be solved. No problems will be solved because they are premised on the same infrastructure. It's sort of the social inequity because those guide the policies. I mean, the sanitation stuff. I mean, like it's criminal, okay? And that criminality is just as about any aspect of their life. You cannot take that out from any other aspect. So until that is fixed, and you know what? The only people who can fix that, it's not you or me, the people who are affected, okay? They're the only people who can fix that, okay? Because if you ask me about the situation in India now, the elite, the intellectual, can't do anything, okay? Because it's all sedition, okay? You speak out, this is about sedition. It really requires a grassroots mobilization to even address these levels of inequity, okay? And so you would see, I'm sure those of you who have, studied this, is writing over water, okay? Water rights are terribly important. We know water rights is probably the most important thing that's going to happen in the next whatever years. So it is, I think what we need to think about, and I work, no matter what I do, I see space and infrastructure, okay? So, but for me, that's a lens to just bring attention to certain modes of historical inequity and its connection. If you ask me why, what actually sort of frustrated me when we were watching those things was having last year, and I'm talking about in India, and we could go to other parts of the world, is that, it is shocking, but it should not be surprising at all. This is how the people live. The state can build infrastructure, and it is state, owned infrastructure, but it can also intervene in private infrastructure, okay, transportation infrastructure. and just withhold it. So the problem is when our colleagues in other fields try to take infrastructure and say, how can we make it better? You can't make it better. You need to fix social inequities. That's what it is.
Yeah, I would just pipe in quickly. I completely agree with that. I mean, I think the point of thinking through infrastructure is to think about the politics behind what is producing, the histories behind what's producing those kind of social inequalities and social injustices and environmental injustices. But I think, and again, it gets back to, again, we can point out things as academics, patterns, and I think the limited reach of that is a major issue for sure. But I do think about the COVID example. It really reminds me in terms of like, suddenly it's like, let's provide these areas with something as if they weren't in a state of emergency before. And I think that's one thing that it may be the tiniest of steps, and maybe it's, you know, I'm not saying it's going to create massive ripple effects on the ground, but the way that we talk about things, I think really does matter. How we define emergency in the public discourse, how we define, right now, I have a project on like how certain cities are branded as waterless, like waterless cities, Cape Town, it's gone waterless, all this. And the waterless city, to me, I'm thinking, well, I've worked in Delhi. Delhi is not branded as waterless, but 50% of the population is not connected to the grid. And according to the WHO is receiving suboptimal levels of water just for basic survival, basically. So that's not waterless. What is? But I think what an emergency is, what the discourse around that is, basically starts to entitle. It justifies certain kinds of entitlements, and it justifies who might be getting an intervention when by the state. And so it affects politics, basically. And so I think in part of getting involved in supporting different political movements is trying to support the effort to reclaim the discourse about how we understand what's going on, if that makes any sense.
If I may add, in terms of thinking about, the part that I presented is a work on sovereignty that I'm looking at, and it concerns colonial India. But we all speak from the present moment, so I have very much the present situation in mind when I'm talking about. But my area of expertise is British Empire. So when I'm looking at that, and something that we always ask is, how is it that so many of those practices are alive and kicking? It has hardly changed across political divides, etc. And that is because, there's also something about the structure of the state. The structure of the state is such, and that, the state cannot apprehend certain forms of infrastructure, like, what you have to present. I love that. The understanding of infrastructure as bodies, not just as what, Abdul Malik would say as, as people. I think that's exactly it. They literally have to form the human chain, right? And if you have never done that, it's kind of hard to even imagine how difficult that work is. Okay, even one has to do water hauling, okay, to know even what that means. Okay, so is that what we are looking at here in terms of the extraordinary violence of military advances and all of that. Is actually, again, related to the everyday violence. Again, there's nothing of emergency here. This is everyday emergency. So that's why I always go back to the Santhal rebellion, and there's excellent work done on that. But there was the normal. The colonial government decided to make the normal the exceptional, because the Santals had done it. Okay, so except that they turned it around, saying that it has to be martial law, because you cannot, none of these are crimes. Like asking for water is not a crime. Okay, this is right. Okay, so how can you criminalize this? or needing to defecate, it's not a crime. It is a necessity. So how can you criminalize that, right? So what the indoor government is doing, it is de facto martial law, except that the military is not doing it. Who needs the military when the ordinary citizens are willing to do it?
I think that was also another point that I wanted to add and ask you all about. It is the role of the state, because obviously, again, the military is obvious in certain cases, but in other cases, the discipline is just done by, by the different class and gendered strata of the communities. But another question for you, and would you also say, could you reflect a little bit maybe about, so in your accounts, you're on the one hand criticizing power, but we also see how different people negotiate power, right? Now, and if we go back to what Shadi said about this is the everyday, and I completely, I come from a country that was war torn by civil war, and we literally say this is our everyday. People would think that I'm cynical, but it is actually our everyday. It's a very pragmatic view. So maybe, I don't know, I wonder if you have any reflections on your, the people you worked with, whether you saw like any kind of agency in that sense, to add to the bigger structural aspects of the state.
This is a question for all of us, correct? Yeah, okay. I can quickly jump in and just say that I didn't get a chance to talk about the agency, but I do think, one of the things I'm kind of working through with the body as infrastructure is thinking how these situated bodies, these groups of people that are disproportionately bearing the brunt of circulating resources, not just for themselves, but for others as well, to the benefit of others, they also do have a very unique vantage point. As Swati was saying, they can see, we don't know what it is to haul water. They know every detail about what it is. And that kind of voice and vantage point is absolutely critical in transformation. And so what I have seen is not a broader social movement in Delhi. And I think a lot of people talk about that. Why? And, in Mumbai, you get these movements that look different than Delhi. But in Delhi, I do see on the ground a lot of women, using their voices in this just spontaneous street rallies when a politician will come through and kind of look at the area, if it's the local MLA or the councillor, and just kind of yell at them and just be like, scream, like, I have to choose between getting my kids to school and sometimes educating my daughters versus water. Like, this is ridiculous, and they will get out there, and it does have a very slow kind of impact. It will mean like a tanker gets moved a little bit closer to their house, or something becomes, a tube well has actually been drilled closer to some of these families that have complained, and the women that have kind of been launching these. So I see micro level kind of quiet resistance, encroachment of like small groups of people. And I know that that's not the kind of transformation we all want to kind of see, but I think it is worthy of noticing, because just like this slow violence, perhaps there is a slow accrual of these kinds of things. I'm not trying to romanticize them, that they just change all the structures, but that they could have some momentum and build into something larger.
I have to go in a couple of 1 minute, actually. So I'll just say, this is a lovely conversation. I wish we could continue this more. But in terms of the question, I think one reason I always use the Santhal rebellion is, when you can think of people who, it's like such imbalance of power. I'm like, you cannot think of more imbalance of power. If they could read the colonial infrastructure and turn it around one by one, it can be done, okay? But when we think about, they had a very complicated notion of agency, because they would not say, the two leaders, Shid and Kanu, they wouldn't say that it was we who did it. It said God did it. So the colonial state has another problem. Can't hang God, but can hang these two guys, right? So if you're like reading through those judicial proceedings, it's like, it's a treat to think about how can a group of people who know their strengths, where their strengths lie, and can respond to a formidable block of power between the Bengali moneylenders, the landlords, and the colonial state. It's actually, it's inspirational. Did they succeed? No, they were crushed. Okay. But that doesn't mean that it is not useful to think of what agency means in that case. This is where I think we like to think that there is a discernible agency in the very Marxist sense that we will always find. It's not there always like that. I think we really need to fine-tune our understanding of what agency is. I think for me, the Santhal Rebellion is a very good reminder of the complicated ideas of agency and where it rests on individuals and community and so on and so forth. Guys, I gotta go because I have to teach a class now. So very nice meeting all of you. And I hope we can continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Shati. Thank you for participating.
Bye.
Yeah, we have a question about the recording.
Yes. Yeah,
I think the recordings are available on the website, Deljana?
Yeah. The website or on the YouTube channel. So on the YouTube channel, it will be immediately. On the website, it will be slightly later.
So the YouTube channel, on the top left of the screen, you will see there's an icon that says YouTube Live. You can follow the link there, or just go to YouTube and look up Sustainable Infrastructure channel, and you'll find all the talks there.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you would like to add anything, something else, we can call this a wrap up if we don't have other questions.
Yeah.
So I would like to thank you. Obviously, we thank Shati, who also. I mean, I'm gonna get in touch with her on because her work is also related to my work on the military aspects. But I want to say this idea of looking at infrastructure and the bodies and how, whether looking at water or sanitation or any other form. I think this is the next level of. It really inspires me because it makes me think of how we are in this age and time. We're literally. While we're in the DIY, era, and while everybody thinks that they can do everything, how much your body gets much more involved in these daily laboring activities. Mm-hmm. And again, obviously, there's a complete difference between a general involvement in many things and between people living in precarious conditions. So that's always something that to be kept in mind. I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending. And we'll see you in the next Infra Plus webinar. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Yaffa.
Thank you so much, Deljana and Swati. Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you, Yaffa.
Thank you, Yahya and Tarquin, for your technical support.
Thank you, Yahya.